Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. This is a very nice setting, a beautiful view and everything. Nice to meet all of you. I'm going to jump directly into this. I'm going to go through it reasonably quickly so that I can answer questions if anybody has any. Oh, by the way, how many of you have read the book? And yet here you are. Okay. General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, one of the more literary figures of the Civil War. Many of you, of course, know who he is. One of the heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg, and later on, three-term governor of Maine, president of Bowdoin College. And he wrote a couple of really outstanding books on the war. And he had this quote that has to do with actually one of the Gouverneur Kemball Warren Court of Inquiry. He supported Warren quite a bit, but it's still apropos. And so it has got into history and never can be gotten out. The story that can be written of these things will not be written. Even the proofs have disappeared. Some of them have, but some of them are still there. You just have to really look in some cases. Okay, the subject of our talk, part of it anyway, Ulysses S. Grant. When the book first came out, one of the things that was immediately apparent was that people who read it seemed to like it. People who didn't like it seemed not to have read it. It struck me as a little odd. One person even reviewed the book after saying, I haven't read this book, and I'm not going to. But here's why I didn't like it. So this was on one of the Civil War chat rooms or something. And I tend to shy away from those things. I really don't like to argue with people on the internet because the anonymity can make them really nasty because I know that you don't know where they live. But anyway, I just said to this guy, do me a favor. Read it. You don't have to buy it, borrow it, take it out of the library, whatever. Read it. And then I'll be happy to meet you right back here in this chat room and discuss with you what you liked or didn't like about it. And he read it. His favorable review is up on Amazon. And no, it wasn't Rob. Rob gave a review pretty quickly. But I still do occasionally run into somebody. Why would you attack a great man? Okay, first of all, if you read the book, you'd know it's really not an attack on Ulysses S. Grant. Number one. Number two, if you think of historical figures as uniformly all good or all bad, generally speaking, you're kind of naive. Ulysses S. Grant was a really good general. I don't think he was a very good president, but that's a subject for another book, not by me. I'm kind of tired. I'm working on the second volume of it now, and I think that's enough. I don't like Grant, dislike Grant, rather. My opinion of him changed a bit when I started researching this, but I did not set out to write a book to diminish Ulysses S. Grant's historical reputation. In fact, I didn't set out to write a book to do anything in particular. I was looking for a dissertation topic. And I'd always been interested in the process of historical memory. So after my dissertation advisor shot down my first half a dozen proposals, we hit on the idea that I was going to look at why we remember history the way we do in the figure of certain Civil War generals. As it happened, I had been rereading Grant's memoirs for a course I was developing. And around about the same time, there was one of these magazine articles where historians periodically rank the presidents. I don't know why they feel compelled to do that, but Grant was where he usually is, pretty near the bottom of the list. And the comment, which you can actually find in almost any high school history book, Ulysses S. Grant was himself a personally honest man, but he was a poor judge of character who surrounded himself with dishonest men. So I said to myself, if Grant was such a poor judge of character, maybe what he said about people in his memoirs was wrong. Because I had noticed as I was rereading them, he really didn't pull his punches about some people. Sometimes he praised people a lot. Other people, not at all. He was really pretty cutting. One of these guys was William S. Rosecrans. So I decided, went back to my advisor, and I said, I would like to look at three generals, William S. Rosecrans, Joseph Hooker, and Gouverneur Kemball Warren, and just see, I find them interesting, just see if maybe they were better generals than we thought. My advisor said, you do realize you could spend several years researching this and come to the conclusion that Grant was absolutely right about them. They really were bad generals. I said, yes, and that I won't have a book, but I will still have a dissertation. At this point, I'll settle for that. So I didn't set out to prove anything. And I certainly did not set out to write a controversial book. but it just seems that I did. Okay, now Grant, as you can see, he's not a particularly impressive guy physically. He's kind of short and he's kind of dumpy, and hey, that's me. But he's not a real impressive person. He's not tall, he's not statuesque. He's sort of an average-looking guy. And he was a pretty smart guy. He was very loyal to his family. There's never been a hint of scandal about his personal life, with the exception of the fact that he was an alcoholic. But, that doesn't necessarily make him a bad person. As a matter of fact, I was speaking at the Grant Cottage this past summer, and no, he didn't rise up and smite me. Although my wife took a great picture, just to digress for a moment. My students are used to me digressing, so, My wife, I'm talking to somebody, and my wife said, "Just stand over there so I can take your picture." So I stood over by the wall of this visitor center, and my wife took a picture, and I couldn't figure out why. I mean, it's not like she hasn't got enough pictures of me now. And then she showed me the picture. And I was standing next to a big portrait of Grant, a poster of Grant, and I'm standing there, and Grant's this really stern look. But anyway, I still admire him on a lot of levels. However, as somebody said to me there, "Do you think he was a bad person because he did these things to these people?" I said, "No, I think he was a human being, not a bad human being." It's human nature to make ourselves look better. It's human nature to attack the people we view as personal enemies. It's not an admirable thing, but we do it. The difference is most of us don't have a whole lot of influence. And this guy was a 2-term president of the United States. So when he said something negative about somebody, it stuck. And in the case of several of these generals, including particularly, I think, William S. Rosecrans, it completely shaped what we think we know about this guy. Few people have noticed the first chapter of my book is what we think we know. And then I take a look at a golden case. One person who read the book was a judge, said he viewed it as though I'm actually literally building a court case. And at the end, he said, you had your summation. And that chapter is called, the first chapter is what we think we know, the last chapter is what we know. Because by the time I got to the end of my research, which took me 5 years, I realized that a lot of what I thought I knew about the Civil War going in fact, turned out to be wrong. And I'll talk a little bit about why that was the case. Okay, Grant's memoirs, published in 1885, encouraged to write them by Mark Twain. Most of you know this already. Grant was heavily in debt. Ulysses S. Grant is a classic rags to riches to rags story. He's a guy who, he came from a pretty good family, went to West Point. The fact that he graduated near the bottom of his class isn't as bad as it sounds, because I don't know the practice at West Point today, but at the time, the bottom third of the class got lopped off every year. Just completing the 4 years was in itself quite an achievement. So don't read too much into the fact that people like Ulysses S. Grant and George Armstrong Custer did not graduate very high in their class. Well, with Custer maybe. But.
That'll be your next one.
Yeah, I live in North Dakota at the moment, and I taught a class on North Dakota history. It didn't take very long. It's a state requirement. Basically, what North Dakota has is George Armstrong Custer left from North Dakota to go to Montana and get killed. That's about it. Well, Grant, he went from being something, he was basically, when the war broke out, he was kind of the town drunk of Galena and something of the village idiot, which was unfair. And he went to become the commander of one of the largest armies in the world, and a 2-term president of the United States. And Joan Waugh's excellent book on Grant, but she didn't contribute a whole lot to the literature of his military career, but she talks a lot about why we remember him as we do, and all about the politics about where he was going to be buried and everything. And it's really interesting that he was incredibly popular at the time. This guy was a rock star. He couldn't go out in public without people standing and cheering him. People waited there. They waited in line to see him. They'd line up outside restaurants where he'd be eating. A very, very popular man. We've kind of forgotten that today. But even so, he did not invest wisely, and he went back to being poor again. In fact, he went back to being, somebody told me once, I'm not a mathematician, that by today's standards, Grant was roughly $15 million in debt. I don't know if those numbers play out or not, but I know he was heavily in debt. And Mark Twain said to him, write your memoirs. People have been after you do it for years, and Grant didn't want to do it. but you saw it as a way to get out of debt. And it worked. He not only got out of debt, but he left his family with a small but substantial fortune. He also took the opportunity to really influence the historical record. But it wasn't just in his memoirs that he did this. He'd been trying this for a long time. You can see it through his military career. His memoirs had never, he finished it just days before his death, and they'd never gone out of print, which is really kind of amazing when you think about it. Widely used by scholars, and sometimes too widely used. I discovered a number of instances of this, which I talk about in the introduction to the book. One is J.F.C. Fuller. Anybody who reads military history is familiar with that name. He's one of the most renowned British military historians ever, and rightly so. He wrote a book called The Generalship of Ulysses S. Grant. In one section of the book, something like 85% of his footnotes, this is a book on the Generalship of Ulysses S. Grant. His footnotes are Grant's memoirs. Now, I'm not comparing Ulysses S. Grant to a monster, but I think if I were writing a biography of Adolf Hitler, I'd refer to a source other than Holy Mein Kampf. And yet, I find this repeated over and over and over, where very fine historians, they're writing about Grant, and they're referring to Grant. Or, another thing I noticed, they'd refer to another historian, and that person would refer to Grant's memoirs. So many times it's not a direct citation, it's an indirect one. And it's easy to understand how this sort of thing happens. You write a book on a subject. You write a book and you cite him. You write a book and you cite them. You write a book and you cite them. And we go around this way till finally you pick up a book and you say, well, this must be true because I've read 8 of their books and they all say the same thing. Yeah, and they all come back to their source. And when that source is Ulysses S. Grant, and you're writing a book about Ulysses, so I'm not faulting the other historians. Somebody said to me, why are you so mean? You point out all these mistakes these other historians made. And I said, well, here's the thing. I teach my students, don't just give me your opinion. It would not be right, it wouldn't accomplish anything for me to get up there and say, a lot of historians say this. I need to prove that statement. So I need to say who says it. Now, these people said it, they put it in print, they footnoted it. There's nothing wrong with me saying, here's what Stephen Woodworth says, and here's his footnote. Here's where he got this is where he put his source. Again, I'm not doing it to be mean, I'm doing it because that's how I build my case. Okay, this is the first indication, the Battle of Belmont, which somebody's picked up a book on that. First indication of Grant falsifying the official record. Now, I didn't find this. As a matter of fact, I was pretty well along in my book, and I realized John Simon, who's now deceased, had found this out. But the problem is, and other people have found this out about Grant and, for example, Hoover Campbell Warren. There's several instances where Grant falsified the official records of the war. I don't mean slanting his reports. I mean literally falsifying documents, destroying documents, inserting false documents, removing documents from the records, altering them and putting them back in again. But historians come across it and they view it as an isolated incident. I happen to be looking at a bigger deal than they were. I was looking at a different topic, a different scope. When you're looking at the Battle of Belmont and you see this, it's an anomaly. But when you're looking at all these other sources and you find it over and over and over, it ceases to be an anomaly. It becomes a pattern of behavior. This is the first instance we see of it. Grant was ordered to make a reconnaissance in force. He enlarged upon those orders and he attacked. And he was very nearly defeated. Now, he did a really good job of extricating his troops from a difficult situation, but it was a difficult situation he'd gotten them into. After he was appointed General-in-Chief, suddenly a document appears in the records of the War Department claiming that A, Grant had been ordered to make this attack, but there's nothing in the official records that shows that order. And B, that he did it because another officer had gotten in trouble. Except the other officer denied that. He sent a letter to his wife. Grant's been going around saying this, but it isn't true. There's also nothing in the Confederate records that indicate that what Grant was saying, that this other officer was in trouble, that his command was under attack by the Confederates. So this is a bit of an anomaly. Now, it may not have been Grant who put it there. He may not have authored, he may not have approved it, he may not have known it was done, but it was done by a member of his staff. And it's kind of like when you have a major scandal, let's say in the athletic department of a big university. You know, there's athletes being paid And the athletic director loses his job because the argument is either you knew or you should have known. And I think this kind of applies here. But you see this pattern of behavior on the part of either Grant or Grant's staff. He either knew or he should have known. Okay, Battle of Shiloh. Again, I realize the book's about Rosecrans and we're not to them yet. What I'm doing here is establishing a pattern of behavior. Also, do bear in mind the original book, the original manuscript, was not just about William S. Rosecrans. It also was about Joseph Hooker and Gouverneur Calhoun Warren, who will be 2/3 of the next book. I'm adding George H. Thomas to that. Grant caught completely by surprise at Shiloh. You folks know the Civil War, so you know whereof I speak. I'm not saying anything you didn't know already. What's interesting, though, is he always denied that. As a matter of fact, he sent in a letter to his father, which somehow wound up in the newspapers. We could not have been more prepared had the rebels notified us 3 days in advance that they were going to attack. Really? Then why had not you entrenched, considering your superior, General Halleck, had ordered you to? Why were you on the wrong side of the Tennessee River? You never want to entrench with a river behind you. That's an invitation to disaster. And most importantly of all, why had you no patrols out? And why were you 8 miles away on the wrong side of the river, out of telegraphic communication with your army when the attack came? If you're not surprised, then you have a lot of explaining to do. Well, he needed a scapegoat. He actually picked 2 of them, Benjamin Prentiss and Lew Wallace. Prentiss, he was the only person who did have patrols out, because Everett Peabody, one of his regimental commanders, had basically disregarded his instructions. The rebels are nowhere around, and sent patrols out. So Prentiss's command was not caught quite as much by surprise as the rest of the Union Army was. And he staged a spirited rearguard action that he became known as the Hornet's Nest. Grant took several hours to reach the battlefield, came to Prentiss and said, hold your position here at all hazards, and then left. Now, I'm not faulting Grant for that. He had a lot of things to do, a lot of battlefield to cover. And Prentiss held for several hours. And then he was shocked to discover that he was holding alone. The rest of the army had fallen back to the line of the Tennessee River. And he tried to fall back, found out he was unable to do so. He'd been surrounded. He was short of ammunition. Confederate artillery was massing in his front, and he surrendered his command. In his memoirs and in his reports after the battle, Grant blamed Prentiss for causing a break in his line. He said basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, the army fought well and fell back to a series of positions, allowing the reader to believe that Grant had this planned, and that in one of these fallbacks, General Prentiss failed to fall back with the rest of the army and allowed himself and his command to be cut off and captured. His other scapegoat was Lew Wallace, who'd been camped upriver at Crump's Landing, there were several roads Wallace could have taken to reach the battlefield. When Grant was hurrying to the battlefield, he stopped at Crump's Landing. Wallace said, "I'm ready to go," and Grant said, "Wait for orders. When I find the situation, I'll send for you." And Wallace waited, and a staff officer rode up and said, "General Grant, needs you at Shiloh. Needs you at the battlefield." And Wallace said, "What's the situation?" He was told, "We are driving them. General Grant wants you on the right flank of the army." Well, Wallace, naturally enough, expected the right flank of the army would be at least where it had been the night before, or forward of that position. So he started to take one of the more inland roads. He'd been marching for a couple of hours. Another rider comes up and says, "General Grant would like you to hurry." There's no indication he's not heading in the right direction, so he simply picks up the pace. Finally, a third officer comes up and said, "General Grant wants you at Pittsburgh Landing, and he wants you there like hell. We've been pushed back to the river, and we may be pushed into it." So Wallace, at this point, turns his army around, and he's late getting to the battlefield. That's not his fault. Had he gotten one of these remarkably clear orders that Grant is famous for having written, apparently, he would have known right away what Grant wanted of him. But Grant blamed Wallace for getting there late. They use this sometimes when I teach my class. My students like pictures, so here's a picture. And there's a map. They like those too. I just want to play with the laser pointer. Okay, you've got Grant's army here, really in no position for defense. There's this massive attack launched. Prentiss holds, while the rest of the army has fallen back to the river. Wallace, meanwhile, starts out this way, discovers going the wrong way, and finally manages to rejoin Grant by marching along the river. Again, it's hard to imagine what either Prentice or Wallace could have done differently, and yet they're both blamed by Grant for his near-defeated Shiloh. General William S. Rosecrans at last. I don't know if I would like General Rosecrans on a personal basis. I mean, I spent a lot of time with him, going through his papers. When you spend several years researching somebody's personal papers, you get a real feel for them. I certainly respect the man a great deal. He, on the other hand, could be kind of prickly. He was easily offended. He had a temper. But one historian said he may have been the only actual genius to command a Union Army in the Civil War. I mean, he had an incredible intellect. And I think he deserves better of history than he's gotten. I think the fact that he hasn't gotten recognition he deserves is largely due to the deliberate efforts of Grant. I was like this. Apparently, somebody saw a picture of Napoleon like this, and they all assumed that that's how you pose for a picture. As far as I know, Napoleon was scratching something. My students asked me, what the hell? Okay, Rosecrans' first major combat in the Civil War is at the Battle of Rich Mountain. He's serving under George McClellan, that dynamic, aggressive leader. And he came up with a plan to attack the Confederate position at Rich Mountain. Rosecrans would swing around and attack from the south. McClellan would attack from the west. McClellan heard the sound of the fighting, concluded immediately that Rosecrans was about to be overwhelmed. So McClellan retired to his camp where he fortified it and awaited the Confederate attack, which never came because McClellan won. Rosecrans won. He was kind of annoyed by this because McClellan was then immediately promoted to command the Army of the Potomac. But here's the interesting thing. We have a tendency to view history as sort of a series of events. We look at each event as a discrete entity, but it's not that way with people who live through it. So the next year at the Battle of Iuka, when a remarkably similar situation develops, where Grant and Ord are supposed to attack from the west while Rosecrans attacks from the south, and they never attack, Rosecrans doesn't take it well, because to him this is exactly what happened to him a year ago. He and his army are fighting for their lives while another Union army within reach isn't coming to their assistance. Okay, Iuka, Mississippi. I'll show you a map of this in a bit, but again,
do you have any pictures?
I know you're waiting for notice. Which of my classes are you in this semester? The plan might look a little familiar. They're trying to drive Sterling Price's Confederate Army out of Iuka. So Rosecrans comes up with a plan. John Mosher, in his book on the Great Generals series, gives credit for the plan to Grant, and he calls it a plan worthy of Frederick the Great. Well, first of all, I think it was overly complicated. It wasn't a very good idea. They're attacking a numerically larger enemy and dividing their forces. And this pre-electronic communications age is the invitation of the disaster. So I don't think it's that great a plan. If Mosher wants to give credit to Grant for it, that's fine. But it actually was Rosecrans' idea, and I don't think it was a very good one. But Rosecrans is going to attack from the south, while Ord's column, under the immediate command of Ord with Grant present, is going to attack from the west. Rosecrans is supposed to close the only two roads out of town to the south. The idea being they're going to trap Price's army. Now, the original plan called for Ord to make the opening attack, and then Rosecrans would attack from the rear while the Confederates are diverted. Their attention is facing west. Ord and Grant never attack. Grant gives as his reason Rosecrans was behind schedule, so I directed Ord to wait until he heard the sound of Rosecrans' guns, and then he would go in. And I so notified General Rosecrans. The problem with that is there's no indication he ever notified Rosecrans. Grant attaches a whole string of messages that he sent. That's not in there anywhere. It's not in the official records anywhere. There's no indication that he ever notified Rosecrans of anything. Rosecrans, he launches his attack against a numerically superior enemy, and here's the problem. As he's approaching, I'll show you the map in a minute, I swear, he realizes, remember, they're not intimately familiar with the territory they're fighting in. They don't have AAA, they don't have really good road maps. And he realizes, think about the letter, think of it as the letter A. Rosecrans is attacking from the south. He's supposed to cover these two roads. But the problem is, as he starts north, he realizes the two roads are too far apart, and the terrain between them is very bad. And if he divides his command, which is already heavily outnumbered, and Sterling Price attacks down one of those two roads, he's going to lose half of his command, because the other half can't come to his support. But he does know about a cross piece of the A, a high in the A, the Bay Springs Road. So what he decides to do is advance everything on one road, but he gets to the Bay Springs Road, swing part of his army east, and then at that point he can cover both roads. It would have worked had Ord launched his attack as scheduled, but Ord never attacked. So Rosecrans is unable to uncover the Bay Springs Road. He's unable to block the easternmost escape route, and Price gets away. At the time, Grant approved it. In his initial, he wrote two reports of the Battle of Iuka. In the first one, he praised Rosecrans's ability and courage, and said, although he didn't cover the easternmost road, when I saw the terrain, I realized why, and he did the right thing. But then he later wrote his second report, in which he criticized Rosecrans for that. And then in his memoirs, he got nastier still. We'll talk about why in a moment. Again, it's interesting. All the fighting in this battle is done by Rosecrans. All of it. But Grant gets credit for the victory, and Rosecrans gets blamed because the Confederates escaped. That's kind of interesting. And it's not an accident. Here's the picture. I couldn't find a picture by Iuka in the 1860s, but I found one in like 1903, and I don't think it looked a whole lot different. No telephone wires, but other than that. Okay. This is the overall. I'm never used to laser pointers. I'm sorry. My students will tell you Dr. Varney is technologically challenged. Okay, here's Corinth. This is the federal base. There's Iuka. Ord and Grant coming this way. Rosecrans is supposed to come south, and then cover these two roads. And I'll show you the roads in a moment. But do bear in mind that they're attacking a larger Confederate force, so this is a very risky plan. Okay, this is a close-up map. Again, here's one of the roads Rosecrans is supposed to attack. This is the other road he's supposed to, this is the other road he's supposed to cover here. And he can't. Look how far apart they are. And all the indications are the terrain was hilly in places, overgrown, swampy, terrible terrain. So if he divides his forces and Price attacks on one or the other, Rosecrans is facing defeat in detail. So he decides he's going to go up here and then take this crossroads, the Bay Springs Road, and then he can cover both roads. But because there's no federal attack from the west, that plan doesn't come to fruition. Okay, these are the charges Grant at the time and or historians later had made against Rosecrans. First, that he was late attacking. That's true, he was. He was behind schedule. But ultimately, it didn't matter because the Confederates hadn't gone anywhere when he launched his attack. Had Grant and Ord attacked, it wouldn't have mattered that the plan was several hours behind schedule. It still would have worked. He took the wrong road. No, that's not true. He was on one of the two roads he was supposed to be on. He just wasn't on the other one. He didn't take the wrong road. But he failed to keep Grant informed as to his movements. That's simply not true. It says right there in the official records. He never says, I changed the plan. But he has one message to Grant in which he said, I'm going to cover the two roads. In the next message, he says, all my forces are on, and he names the westernmost road. Obviously, he's not covering the other. That he failed to cover the escape route. Well, that's true, but he had good reasons, which even Grant acknowledged at the time were legitimate. That he managed his troops poorly, there's no indication of that. One historian said he was at the rear of his column instead of the front. Well, he's trying to hurry his troops along in bad terrain. Once the battle started, he moved to the front. And that he didn't pursue aggressively. That's Grant's charge, which historians have doggedly and dutifully repeated ever since, and it's simply not true. Here's the oddity of all this. Rosecrans' men make a forced march all night and then fight all day. Ord's column moves 8 miles and suffers 1 man wounded. And yet, who does Grant send in pursuit? Rosecrans' command, who are exhausted and outnumbered. That's sort of odd. Why doesn't he send Orr's command? And then Grant, who in later years would claim that there should have been a much more persistent pursuit, although he never actually ordered one, and certainly could have led it himself. Grant leaves and goes to Tennessee. He's in Mississippi here. Goes to Tennessee to visit his family while the pursuit is going on. Obviously, he didn't place a real high priority on it at the time. Here's the questions we should be asking, but historians haven't asked. Did Grant provide adequate leadership? No, he didn't. He's not with the attacking column. I mean, one historian's criticizing Rosecrans because when the action opens, he's at the rear of his column and then moves to the front. Grant, meanwhile, he's not even within the sound of the guns. And yet he gets credit for the victory, while Rosecrans is blamed for the Confederate escape. So who won the battle by you? Rosecrans, whose command did all the fighting, or Grant, whose command did nothing at all? So what went wrong at Grant's headquarters? Well, here's what's interesting. One of the truisms among historians and students of the Civil War is that Grant had a drinking problem. Now, there were people who say, no, he didn't. I think he probably did. We have enough indications that the man was probably an alcoholic, probably a recovering alcoholic. It doesn't make him a bad person. There's a lot of people who have a drinking problem. He had, after all, that's why he was out of the Army before the war. He kind of drank his way out of the Army. He had, supposedly, this problem that only flared up when he was either separated from his family and didn't have John Rawlins with him. Rawlins was his chief of staff. He was Grant's friend from before the war, and he was an ardent teetotaler. And he used to get furious with Grant if there was any indication Grant was around alcohol. Of course, Grant's family was not in the field with him in this instance, and Rawlins was sick, in fact, in Corinth. He didn't accompany the column. Grant, in his memoirs, said he remained at the depot at Burnsville and directed his columns. There is a period of 40 hours, where there is not a single written order from Grant's headquarters to anyone. That's odd. The only message that comes from Grant's headquarters is signed by one of his aides. And then that aide and another aide got on their horses and rode all the way around to where Rosecrans was to ask him what the plan of action was. Why? They were at Grant's headquarters. One of these colonels is signing documents in Grant's name. You got to ask what's going on in the depot at Burnsville. Now, Grant is accused after the battle, as most losing Civil War generals, or even generals who simply, in this case, didn't perform to expectations, was accused of being drunk in command. Usually, that's basically a crock. I think in this case, there may be some substance to the rumor. But here's the problem. Whether it's true or not, it's going to cause a lot of problems between Grant and Rosecrans. I'll tell you why in a moment. Okay. Brings us to the Battle of Corinth, not much later. Grant disperses his command after the Battle of Iuka. Price has been driven off. Grant has about 42,000 men. He leaves the bulk of them in Corinth with Rosecrans. Now, he would claim later that he began losing faith in Rosecrans. If that's the case, then why did he leave Rosecrans in command of the most important of the positions he had to hold, with the largest percentage of Grant's force? Grant, meanwhile, is at Jackson, Tennessee, 58 miles away. Rosecrans is attacked by the combined armies of Sterling Price, whom he had just fought a few weeks before and who had outnumbered him, and Earl Van Dorn. And in very heavy fighting, he manages to beat off the attack. Grant later claims Rosecrans ruined Grant's master plan by not pursuing aggressively, and historians have repeated this ever since. One historian referred to it almost like a grand chess match. But there's no indication of any plan. If you look in the official records, there are no documents outlining any kind of a plan. There's not a whole lot, and even there's several independent commands who were set in motion during this battle. You've got Rosecrans. You've got another column led by McPherson, whom Grant dispatches to come to Rosecrans' aid. You've got another column led by Stephen Hurlbut, who comes from Boulevard, 30 miles west. Grant makes it sound as though all this was happening according to some intricate plan he had devised. But there's no reference to any of this ahead of time. Even if Grant had personally met with all these people, and they sat around a table, and Grant said, okay, here's what we're going to do if they attack, then you would expect at the very least he would fire off orders to these independent commanders and say, implement Plan A. There's no indication of any of this. None. There's no plan ahead of time. Grant is reacting to the Confederate moves, which is perfectly appropriate. But then don't claim later on that somebody violated your plan, because there wasn't a plan. And we see him doing this over and over again. It happens in several instances. And here's the thing again, Grant's always gotten credit for this victory. He won the Battle of Corinth. Really? He was 58 miles away. Rosecrans fought the battle, and he won the battle. He then pursued the defeated Confederate force until he was called off by Grant. There's nothing in the official records of Grant criticizing his pursuit during the pursuit. It's later he does it in hindsight. There are orders of Grant calling him off. Rosecrans is replying to Grant's persistent attempts to make him stop the pursuit by saying, "We can end this now." Grant complains to Halleck, "I had to recall him 3 times before I could get him to turn around." But then he claims Rosecrans didn't pursue aggressively. So my question to you, if Grant is in control sufficiently to get credit for the battle from 58 miles away, why is he not in sufficient control to take the blame for the Confederate escape? If you're going to blame Rosecrans for that, then why doesn't he get credit for winning the victory? It just seems odd somehow. Okay, again, just a map of Corinth, because some people like maps and pictures. Okay, here's the Confederate attack. Here's Rosecrans' position. One historian actually said, well, because Hurlbut actually comes into the retreating Confederates, and there's a big section in the chapter. I'm not going to go through excruciating detail here on this. Read the book, as a matter of fact. Grant later, some historians, later on would say, Hurlbut and his men are fighting for their lives. Rosecrans spends a restful afternoon in Corinth. Really? The fighting at one point was lapping around the yard of his headquarters. He had a horse killed under him. One of his aides was shot next to him. Rosecrans was covered with blood from this aide. A bullet cut Rosecrans' saber strap. This is a restful afternoon? Not by my standards. I spent a restful afternoon today. I was down by the pool. Here's the truth of Corinth. There's absolutely no indication Grant had any plan in place prior to the battle, or he would claim afterwards that he had. Rosecrans did, in fact, pursue aggressively. And again, Grant's 58 miles away, had very little control over events. So why does he get credit for winning a battle? Okay, this guy. Would you buy a used car from this guy?
Check the nuts.
I think a hill in Atlanta after.
Mortimer Leggett. A chapter in the book. One historian was sort of lukewarm about the book in the early stages. I did a lot of editing after he made some very good suggestions. He loved this chapter. It's called History of a Man Named Mortimer. Did you know Mortimer Leggett had a huge impact on the Civil War? Yeah, me either. He was a colonel with Hurlbut's command. And after Corinth, he sent a letter to John Rawlins. And he claimed, okay, all these newspaper stories start to appear, claiming that Grant was drunk in command at Iuka, which I actually think he might have been. Mortimer Leggett says, Rosecrans is behind these. Now, if you've ever read this letter, it is freaking hysterical. First of all, his punctuation is very creative. It looks like somebody dumped a box of commas on the page. Spelling, this is a man who didn't seem to ever spell a word in the same way twice. He admits in the letter he doesn't know this, he just believes it's true. And it is the ultimate kiss-butt letter. He talks about Grant being saintly. He is the greatest general we have. Everything's italicized, The greatest general we have, and he has the patience of a saint, and if anything happens to him, our cause is lost. And the minions of a newly minted major general are out to bring him down. Can something be done about this? Well, the next day, by a pure coincidence, is when Grant wrote his second report of the Battle of Iuka, the one in which all of a sudden it's all Rosecrans' fault. Also, he fires off a telegram to Rosecrans. And Leggett made all these other comments in there about Rosecrans thinks that he commands the army, not you. And Grant said, you seem to think you command the army, not me. What an amazing coincidence. There's 3 or 4 things that almost word for word echo what Leggett had said in the letter sent to Grant's headquarters the day before. Rosecrans and Grant, their relationship is completely shot. It was bad before. This basically puts the finishing touch on it. Rosecrans demands that Grant either prove what you said, or have me transferred to another department. Well, the transfer comes through a few days later. And it brings up an interesting, before we get to Stones River, brings up an interesting thing. I talk about it in the book. Julia Grant also wrote a memoir. And some of what we think we know about the Civil War we get from that. She speaks about this cabal of disaffected officers. She shows up at Grant's headquarters, and these officers all come and tell her that the general needs to do something about Rosecrans. He won't do anything because he's so loyal and he's such a great guy, but Rosecrans is operating behind him. All these generals are conveniently dead by the time she writes this. And what's interesting is historians have no problem with citing her without noticing that some of what she says directly criticizes what her husband says in his memoirs. Particularly in regards to the transfer of Rosecrans. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. It's in the book if you're interested. And if you're not, you wouldn't want to hear me talk about it anyway. So. Okay, so Rosecrans is given an independent command. It had been Don Carlos Buell's army. He renames it the Army of the Cumberland. He has to completely reorganize it. It's got a mishmash of weapons. Although it had been in 3 major actions, no unit had been in any more than one of those actions. Some hadn't been in any. Some of the men hadn't been paid in 6 months, which led to a really interesting exchange of letters between Rosecrans and Secretary of War Stanton, in which Stanton basically said, it's not important for morale. They'll get paid when they get paid. And Rosecrans responded, you have a screw loose somewhere, if you believe that. I love it. Can you imagine writing that to the Secretary of War? You got a screw loose somewhere? He fights Braxton Bragg at Stones River. And he wins. And again, there's a chapter on it in there. There's a lot of controversies about the battle. And Rosecrans' performance is certainly not perfect, but he does win the battle. But later in the war, Lincoln is talking to his cabinet. He's talking about a recurring dream he's had the night before. And he said, every time I've had this dream, it's followed by the next day by news of the victory. And he rattles off several battles. One of them is Stones River. Ulysses Grant interrupts the President of the United States to say, Stones River was not a victory. Kind of petty, don't you think? Lincoln says, on that we'll have to disagree. Consider, Rosecrans fights an army of slightly larger size than his. By the way, William S. Rosecrans is the only Union Army commander who was outnumbered in every battle he fought. That's something to think about, because most of the time they're not outnumbered. They usually have the numerical advantage. Rosecrans is outnumbered in every battle. And yet he's basically 6-1. And the one we're going to talk about. He took out a larger army. It was a very near thing. He inflicted more casualties than he sustained. He held control of the battlefield at the end of the fight. And Bragg retreated retreated to a point beyond where he had launched his campaign from. What exactly else was Rosecrans supposed to do to call it a victory? Much like what exactly should Benjamin Prentiss and Bill Wallace have done differently at Shiloh? What more can you do? I see. Okay. Rosecrans, in the Tullahoma campaign, designed and led a brilliant campaign of maneuver. It's still taught at some Army staff colleges, not just in the United States. It's a masterpiece of organization and planning. If you go back and look at the official records, my original chapter on this was like 39 pages long, and the editor said, no, that's way too long. And he was right. But I was just fascinated by the organizational skills exhibited here. He drives Bragg and his army, Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee, completely out of Tennessee. It doesn't get much credit. First of all, Grant criticized him for not doing it more quickly. But officers today, a lot of them who looked at this campaign say there's perfectly legitimate reasons why Rosecrans didn't move more quickly than he did, and they cite all the logistical problems. You know, it's not just a case of willpower. You take your army and go find the other guy and fight him. You've got to make sure your ducks are in a row. You've got to have sufficient horses in this age. You've got to have ammunition. You've got to have supplies. There's all kinds of things that have to take place before you can go fight the battle. And Rosecrans is dealing with other issues like superior Confederate cavalry, which again I discussed. Historians have dutifully repeated these charges, and one historian with whom I was talking said, bottom line is, Halleck ordered Rosecrans to attack, he should have attacked. I said, really? Suddenly you think Henry Halleck is a military genius? Everything you've ever written implies you don't think Halleck knows his way around the battlefield. But Rosecrans, who is apparently a pretty gifted Army commander, is supposed to simply say, well, if Halleck told me I got to do it, I got to do it. Because if he loses, Halleck is not going to be the one who takes the blame from his desk in Washington. Rosecrans is. And men are going to die. And one thing I will say in favor of Henry Halleck, when Rosecrans pressed him on this point and said, I'm really not ready to move, Halleck's response was, well then, okay, I'm not going to order you to move if you're not ready. You're the best judge of that. But two other things happened at around the same time, which also keep this this campaign from a lot of notoriety. Two major events. Taken together, these three things signify a turning point in the war. On July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, Robert E. Lee is defeated at Gettysburg, and on July 4th, Ulysses S. Grant takes Vicksburg. And in the same time frame, the Tullahoma campaign takes place. Next to these two titanic events, Tullahoma looks fairly tame. There's not an awful lot of bloodshed, but it's a brilliant campaign. And again, taken together, these three things are incredibly significant. Okay, brings us to the Battle of Chickamauga. Rosecrans, from the Tullahoma campaign, he gets himself reorganized. It's a matter of a few weeks. It's not like he drags for months, and yet historians still criticize him for not moving immediately, in spite of the fact he's moving into very difficult terrain. He's supposed to take Chattanooga, and he does. Braxton Bragg falls back in front of him. Rosecrans takes Chattanooga, and then he's urged by Stanton, end it now. So he continues to pursue. He's being informed by the men in Washington that troops have been detached from Bragg's army to reinforce Lee in Virginia. In fact, the opposite is true. Longstreet's corps is on its way to join Bragg. Bragg is basically dropping back to buy time. When he gets the reinforcement, he turns at bay and launches a massive counterstroke at Rosecrans, who, by the way, has been reinforced because of the inactivity. Bragg has been reinforced because of the inactivity of two other Union generals, Ambrose Burnside, based in Knoxville, who is supposed to operate, he's supposed to link up with Rosecrans' left flank. He never moves. And one Ulysses S. Grant, who is sitting around Vicksburg at this point, figuring out what to do next. He's ordered to operate on Rosecrans' strategic right. And coincidentally, the telegraph goes down just in time for him to not get that order, and goes back up just in time for him to be informed he has to take command of Rosecrans' army. His choice of relieving Rosecrans or leaving him in place. I'm sorry, I find the timing incredibly just amazing. And once Grant finally does get the message, he sends the corps that's farthest away instead of the corps that's closest. Again, there's more detail in the book, but Bragg's army is reinforced even before Longstreet's two divisions arrive because of the inactivity of Burnside and Grant. Rosecrans was defeated at Chickamauga, no doubt about it. But it's not the shattering defeat that we often read about. There's more to it than that. And again, do bear in mind, the original goal of the campaign was to capture Chattanooga, which he did hold. Rosecrans gets betrayed by his own chief of staff, one James A. Garfield. We'll talk more about President Garfield in a moment. And he's relieved of command by Grant and replaced by Thomas. Okay, a little more detail. Standard histories say that Rosecrans panicked and fled. When one wing of his army collapsed, Rosecrans was caught up in that collapse, panicked, and left the battlefield. According to that, James Garfield helped save the day by riding to where George H. Thomas was holding on the left. And Rosecrans is depicted as weeping on his knees before his confessor. Rosecrans was a Roman Catholic and took a lot of heat for that too, by the way. That he was incoherent, unable to write an order. There's several witnesses to this supposed incident. Most of them denied it ever happened, which is really interesting because you never read about those. You hear about the people who tell you it did happen. Of those who did say it happened, none of them are really credible. Let's look at them. Okay, Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana. Dana had been with Grant at Vicksburg, and all of a sudden he magically appears with Rosecrans. There's no orders in the official records sending him there. So he may have been sent by Grant, we don't really know. Dana, immediately after the battle, the collapse, he sends an email, yeah. Well, you all know that he pulled out on his smartphone. He sends a telegram to Washington, and he says, today is a black day for our fortunes. It's just a terrible defeat, and he goes on to list the catastrophe. And that's cited all the time. What's not cited is a telegram he sent. I almost said email again. A telegram he sent several hours later in which he said, kind of basically, I'm boiling it down, okay, I overreacted a little. Things aren't as bad as I said. I said this was happening, it didn't. I said this was happening, it didn't. No. Everything's fine. We're okay. For some reason, that never gets into the history books. That's lost in the shadow of that first message, because the first message is really dramatic. Also, Dana said in that second message, I cannot speak too highly of the courage of General Rosecrans, who, as far as I can tell, made no mistakes. And I'm paraphrasing slightly here. Dana, however, kind of gets his marching orders from Stanton, his boss. And from that point on, everything he says about Rosecrans is quite negative. Even if he's praising Rosecrans' staff or subordinate officers or the Army of the Cumberland itself, Rosecrans is treated very negatively. That's sort of odd. It's like the Army's running itself without Rosecrans. Let's go to the guy on the other side, General Jacob Cox. Okay. James Garfield, I'm going to talk about in a minute, is going to lie about what happened, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Well, Cox is frequently cited as one of these witnesses who saw Rosecrans in a state of collapse. But Cox says he got the story from Garfield. So if Garfield lied, Cox is an eyewitness to it in any case. So we can just discount him. This guy is really pretty interesting. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a photo. I simply started to wonder, because of something else which I'll talk about in a moment, whether this whole story was true. So I started to look at where these accounts came from, and I realized they came from only a handful of sources. So I eliminated the others, and then I was, well, what about Huff? He's the one who actually was supposed to be Rosecrans unable to issue a coherent order. Well, at the time, I teach in Dickinson, North Dakota. And at the time, the only place you could fly from there was Denver. That was it. He used to say, if the second coming happens, Jesus Christ will have to change planes in Denver if he wants to get to it. Why he'd want to go there, I have no idea. Don't get me wrong. Dickinson State University is a wonderful school. It really is. But Dickinson itself is in the middle of the oil boom, and housing prices are roughly quadrupled, which is why I know I have a 200-mile round-trip commute. Yeah. Well, anyway, but I love my job. Great school. If you have kids, feel free to send them there. And if you want to look at maps and pictures, feel free to take them. Well, Huff's papers wound up in Denver by pure coincidence. So, since that was the only place I could reasonably fly to anyway, I went there and I looked at his papers. He never said what's been attributed to him. I looked at his journals, I looked at his after-action reports, I looked at his letters. He never says it. Instead, what I found, that account we have came from his son, who was not at the Battle of Chickamauga. I'm not sure he was even born then. Somewhere along the line, this got into the record as the testimony of Alfred Lacey Huff, when in fact he never said it. And matter of fact, he, in his letters and in his reports, he talks about Rosecrans issuing clear and coherent orders. So he didn't say it. So where are we getting it from? Okay, James Garfield. By the way, one of the ironies that make me love history, and there are so many, Garfield, who survived one of the bloodiest battles of the war, would be shot down in a Washington, D.C. railroad station on the 18th anniversary. Oh, excuse me. Would linger for 71 days and die on the 18th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga. Which is amazing. It's kind of like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both dying on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Well, Garfield was Rosecrans' chief of staff. And he did a little bit of undercutting of his boss at times, but by and large, Rosecrans viewed him as a good friend, and he certainly trusted him. While the Union Army is besieged in Chattanooga, Garfield wins congressional election. He's heading to Washington to take his seat at the urging of Rosecrans. And George H. Thomas pulls him aside and said, when you get to Washington, quell these damned unfair rumors about Rosecrans. Garfield said, I will. And I think he probably meant it. And then he was intercepted in Lexington, Kentucky by Edwin M. Stanton. Lincoln's Vice President, Andrew Johnson. I knew Johnson. I could think Lyndon. I knew that wasn't right. Andrew Johnson. And Stanton, according to General C.C. Augur, who was the only other person present at this meeting, Stanton said to Garfield, here's what you're going to tell the president when you get to Washington, D.C. Because Stanton wanted Rosecrans gone. And Garfield went to Washington, D.C. and did as he was bade. Now, interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, I stopped at the Garfield House in Mentor, Ohio. And I'm taking the tour. I had no particular agenda. I'm just taking a tour. It's an interesting house. Incredible library, by the way. And there's 3 portraits on the wall. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Edwin M. Stanton. That's odd. So after the tour, I asked the woman who given the tour, were these here when President Garfield was alive? She said, yes. He said they were the 3 most influential men in his life. Okay, I can kind of see Washington and Lincoln, absolutely, but Stanton? But if Stanton is the propelling force behind Garfield's political career, which he seems to have been, this becomes more understandable. By the way, another one of those little bits of trivia I love. Maybe some of you know this, but Garfield was an amazing person. He could write letters, 2 different letters, write with both hands at the same time, 2 different letters. One in Latin and one in Greek. Wow. Isn't that incredible? I can barely do one at a time. Okay, again, I've told you all this. Now, what's interesting is Garfield later recanted privately the story about Rosecrans to James Gilmore, another staff officer of Rosecrans. But he never recanted publicly. Oh, by the way, Dana later apologized to Rosecrans for what he'd said and said, there were things I said about you which, if you said they were wrong, you would be correct. So Dana distances himself from this account as well. Okay, here, Edwin M. Stanton, whom Ed Bars calls that son of a bitch Stanton. And Andrew Johnson, who's apparently scratching something. Okay, did Rosecrans really panic? Well, there's not a single credible account. I just showed you all the eyewitnesses who were always cited. None of them are credible. Several eyewitness accounts, like 5 or 6, say, these are all staff officers who were there, say it's not what happened. Some of them say it at the Times and newspapers. Some of them go before congressional subcommittees and testify it didn't happen. But it made its way into the history books. It's a better story. And here's the thing, this is what triggered, I mentioned before that something got me wondering. This is what got me wondering. When Rosecrans was later appointed to command in Missouri, every one of his staff officers asked to be reassigned to him. All right, some of you folks are probably veterans. Would you want to be serving under an officer who had panicked and abandoned his army on the battlefield? Would you ask to be reassigned to him? I wouldn't. You'd think these guys would want to be as far away from Rosecrans as they could get. Every one of them asked to be reassigned to him. These are the reasons Grant gave for relieving Rosecrans from command. His men lost faith in him because he panicked. No, he didn't. His army was starving. You know what? It wasn't. We keep hearing all these things about Grant took command and opened the cracker line in a few days and saved the Army of the Cumberland. How do we know that? Grant told us he did. And if you look at a lot of the histories, they cite Grant, quote him directly. But when I was looking through journals and letters, dozens of journals and hundreds of letters, I was astonished to find out that, first of all, conditions in the Army of the Cumberland weren't as bad as I thought they were. Even Montgomery Meigs, the Quartermaster General of the Union Army, visited Chattanooga, and his report, which was 7 days before Rosecrans was relieved, said this army is most admirable and everything's fine, basically. There's ample food. Also, the soldiers are referring to the cracker line by that name 10 days before Rosecrans was relieved of command. And the Operation Grant launched. Rosecrans had designed it completely before he was relieved of command. All Grant did, that's why Grant was able to launch this incredibly complex operation 3 days after taking command. Rosecrans already had everything in motion. We have the decision of a committee convened by a later Secretary of War to investigate that. We have the testimony of Joe Hooker, who said, I knew Rosecrans' plans before I ever got there. Because Hooker and his corps, he was sent with 2 corps to come to the assistance of Rosecrans. So all of this stuff that Grant says why he relieved Rosecrans from command, none of it's true. But if you pick up any history of the Battle of Chickamauga, you'll see that in there. Okay, Grant and Stanton try very hard to make Rosecrans sit out the rest of the war. Lincoln won't have it. Over their objections, he reappoints Rosecrans to the highly contentious Department of Missouri, the Missouri quagmire, as I call it. And again, it's a very complicated. I've already beat folks to that in more detail than you probably ever wanted to know. This is also a way of getting it by the book. Okay. But he appoints Lincoln to command. Grant promptly sets about removing nearly all of Rosecrans' troops from him. In some cases, for a good reason. John Bell Hood had launched his counterattack. George H. Thomas needed men, and Grant took them from Rosecrans. However, he does this just as Sterling Price is launching his great Missouri raid. He leaves Rosecrans with very inadequate forces. Rosecrans directs a campaign which drives Price out of Missouri and inflicts heavy casualties, and his reward is another removal by Grant for not doing it quickly enough. Also, I found this really interesting. Now, some of this is speculative. I happened to be talking to a Chicago homicide detective. We're talking about circumstantial evidence. And it is circumstantial, but it is evidence. One of the things that's interesting about history is we don't have to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. We have to build a strong case, and then let the reader decide. You can decide if you think I'm right or not. That's fine. You may disagree with me. That's fine, too. But I can build a pretty strong circumstantial case for things like Grant having been drunk in command at Iuka. And for this, Rosecrans he had a number of messages he was trying to get through to Lincoln that he had covered evidence of a plot. There were going to be 3 great raids launched into the North within a certain time frame, which he illuminated, in conjunction with assassinations and sabotage, including attacks on prisoners of war camp and arming Confederate prisoners in the North, who would then be set free to rampage. Riots in northern cities, and he gave a time frame for all this. He kept trying to get messages through to Lincoln, and those messages were blocked by Stanton and Grant. Now, one critic said, "Oh, Varney's claiming this great conspiracy that Stanton and Grant are behind the Lincoln assassination." No, I'm not. What I'm saying is, Rosecrans was trying to get around them. They didn't like him. They didn't take what he was saying seriously. They thought he was full of soup. And Rosecrans, in trying to get around them, he knew perfectly well these men are his personal enemies, particularly Stanton. It's not that he thought they were disloyal. It's that he knew they were not going to take him seriously. So he sent an officer, one of his staff officers, Major Frank Varney, one of those people who had been present at Rosecrans' supposed breakdown in Chickamauga, and then had asked for reassignment to him. He sent Bond to Washington to warn Lincoln personally, and Bond was intercepted by Stanton's orders, arrested, and court-martialed for leaving his department without permission, even though he'd been sent by his department commander. And he was, of course, acquitted. The raids take place. 2 of them do. One is Price's Missouri raid. The other is Jubal Early's raid into Pennsylvania, which results in the burning of Carlisle Barracks. The third, I believe, was to have been John Hunt Morgan's raid. Morgan was moving north at the time that he was killed by a Union cavalry raid on his headquarters. But his command was moving north at that point, apparently preparatory to raiding into Ohio. So, and there was at least one assassination. Okay, obviously one question we had is, why did Grant do this to Rosecrans? Well, first of all, again, if you do it in the context of a larger picture, you can see he does it to several people. According to Grant, as he put it, I could not make him do as I wished. And I think that's part of it. Rosecrans was a very independent thinker. So was Gouverneur Kimball Warren. So was Joe Hooker. So was John McClernand. So was George H. Thomas. According to Joe Hooker, Thomas got in trouble with Grant because he refused to admit that the Army of the Cumberland needed rescuing by Grant. According to William Truesdale, there's more to the story. Truesdale was, today we would call him Rosecrans' G2 officer. He was an intelligence officer. He was chief of military police under Rosecrans. I was doing research at UCLA where the Rosecrans papers wound up, and I came across a letter. Well, what happened was I was running out of time. Any of you do research know how that works. You have a certain time frame in which you can get someplace and a certain amount of money and a certain, So towards the end of the 2 weeks my wife and I had at UCLA, anything that looked interesting, we made arrangements to have it photocopied. So I got back to Cornell, going through this stack of papers that caught up with me, and I find this letter written by William Truesdale to Rosecrans. And he said in it, your problems with General Grant go back farther than you know. I think They have to do with the Commission to investigate black market cotton speculation in Mississippi in 1862 that you headed. It was apparently set up by Halleck. Then he said, I'll tell you more when I see you. And I said, no, tell him now. So I set out to find the records of this commission. There should have been a stack of paper like this. I mean, you've got to have, testimony by witnesses. You've got to have, there's probably bills of lading. There's insurance documents. You guys probably know what this is about, but just in case you don't, cotton, of course, is in very short supply because the vast majority of it at this time was grown in the South. Union textile mills are screaming for cotton. So are the textile mills in Europe. It's a very valuable commodity, and as the Union Army moves through the South, it liberated cotton. And according to policy, it was supposed to be auctioned off to help support the war effort. But a lot of it just sort of disappeared into the pockets, into the hands of speculators, and into the pockets of these same speculators and some Union generals. So Halleck established this commission to look into it. Well, there should have been all this documentation. I checked the National Archives, I checked the Library of Congress, I checked the Army Military History Institute. It wasn't anywhere. The Army never throws anything away. Should have been somewhere. So I thought, well, maybe Rosecrans kept copies. I mean, there's 69 boxes of papers, and you see, I've been through a fairly small sample of them. So I applied for a grant to go back, which a friend of mine called the Grant Grant. Aided, by the way, by a letter I had found, an exchange of letters between Rosecrans and his brother, who was chaplain of Notre Dame. And his brother had urged Rosecrans, take your problems with Grant to the public. Go to the press, like Grant's doing to you, and tell the country your side. And Rosecrans responded and said, that's not the kind of man I am, and it's not the kind of man I want to be. I live secure in the knowledge that someday a historian yet unborn will vindicate me. And I said in my letter of application, I'd like to be a historian. With your help, maybe I can be. So I got my grant. I went back to UCLA, and I didn't find the documents I was looking for. But the last day I was there, I had to catch a plane at 2 o'clock. At 9 o'clock in the morning, I found what happened to them. I found another letter from William Truesdale. It was written, obviously, by a man at the end. Very shaky, almost incoherent in places, rambling. And he said, this apparently took place in the interim between Rosecrans' relief from command at Chattanooga and the assumption of the command by Thomas and Grant. Truesdale, as part of Rosecrans' staff, had stayed on to enable the transition. And he said an officer, he named the officer, was sent by General Grant and demanded all the records of the commission on cotton speculation and any letters pertaining thereto. I protested and said they were the property of the Army and the property of General Rosecrans, and he assured me you would get copies. Nobody got copies. The Army didn't, Rosecrans didn't. So I think I know what happened to those documents. Now here's the question. If there's nothing in them, it's possible they're perfectly innocent. But if that's the case, then why would Grant send an officer to get them a year after? Something's going on. And then I found something else out. In the same period in question, Jesse Grant, Grant's father, who was something of a loose cannon, signed a contract with a firm in Cincinnati that he would get 1/3 profits for all cotton he could lay his hands on. Now, this doesn't mean Grant did anything wrong. As I said, Jesse Grant was something of a loose cannon. On the other hand, we have to consider Grant's infamous order banning Jews from his area of operation on the grounds that they were indulging in black market cotton speculation. Maybe he's just eliminating the competition. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot below the surface. By the way, Truesdale closed his letter by saying he was in fear for his life. So naturally enough, I wonder what happened to him. He died. It was a war. People died. What's interesting, though, is that when his widow applied for the pension after the war, Grant refused it. Didn't say why. Letter from Colonel Arthur Duckett to William S. Rosecrans. Duckett is a frequent witness whom I use. He was present in many of the actions of the Army to Cumberland. The longer I live, the more I am convinced the history of our war will not be written and accepted as history in our day. Let us do what we can to assist them who come after us and who may not publish the jealousies and misdirection, but do what is fair and just to all alike. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what many other historians are trying to do. Dave Moore just published a biography of William Rosecrans. I met Dave at, interesting little side story. I met him at the dedication of the Rosecrans Memorial last September. William S. Rosecrans was the only Union Major General who didn't have a statue. He now has one. My wife and I were present at the dedication, as were 41 Rosecrans descendants, and we named us honorary Rosecranses. And by an astonishing coincidence, on the flight out here, God, was it only yesterday? It was. Seems like a week ago. I've been so busy. I'm sitting next to a young woman. We got in a conversation. I'm at the talking, and she looked very much like the Rosecrans descendants. They have kind of a look in common, sort of a Roman nose, freckles, and red hair. She's a Rosecrans descendant. Oh, what are the odds? I mean, okay, and to be continued in volume 2. The final chapter in that volume is called Lies, Damned Lies, and the Memoirs of Ulysses Grant. Okay. Anybody have any questions?
One question. You mentioned that Chattanooga, that the Union Army wasn't starving.
Mm-hmm.
However, I believe there is an exchange between Grant and Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
And Thomas answers, "We will hold this position until we starve."
Right. What Grant doesn't quote is the rest of that response, which is, there are 250,000 rations in storehouses and more on the way.
Interesting.
Does Grant have a problem with the Army of the Cumberland? Because Thomas did not fare well after Rosecrans when he took over either.
He has a problem with the commanders of the Army of the Cumberland. I don't know if he has a problem with the troops, but it's interesting that for an army that supposedly had lost confidence in its commander, which, and again, Grant claimed, I took command, I investigated the situation, and for the reasons that I listed there, I had to relieve him. As a matter of fact, two individuals said that they asked Lincoln, and this is in 2 separate conversations and 2 separate letters to Rosecrans, and Lincoln said that Grant said he would only accept the command if Rosecrans went. So that was a condition if he's accepting the command. The problem he had with Thomas, and again, I'm not going into a lot of detail here, Battle of Chattanooga will be in volume 2, is that at the Battle of Chattanooga, Sherman, Grant's golden boy, lets him down.
Yeah.
Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland exceed orders and carry the day. By the way, and my issue with Grant there is that Grant does everything he can to make it look as though he intended that attack to take place exactly as it did, which is, again, it's not true. Thomas began his report, first of all, of the operation of Brown's Ferry, which cleared the route of the Cracker Barrel, pursuant to the orders of General Rosecrans. Okay, so this is after Grant's trying to get credit for that. Thomas always denied that Grant's story that Grant had intended the attack. In fact, Thomas, among others, directly contradicted it. And he refused to admit, because it wasn't true, that the Army of the Cumberland was starving and needed to be rescued by Grant. And according to Joe Hooker, this is why Thomas was banished to what Hooker considered a remote posting, San Francisco. If you've ever been to San Francisco, actually now it's pretty nice.
About a year and a half ago, I guess it was, at my roundtable in Tennessee, we had Mark Laus at the University of Cincinnati, who's just now issued the 2nd volume of his Price of Missouri campaign. And in his program he gave us that night, he talked about Rosecrans handling the Price. And for me, as a fan of Rosecrans, it's a very un-Rosecrans-like manner. And the way he described it was, he wanted the problem of Price coming into Missouri to go from his inbox to his outbox as quickly as possible without a lot of him getting involved.
Yeah.
In fact, it's the sub-commanders out in the field
That's right.
that do far more.
As I mentioned, Rosecrans ran the campaign. He didn't direct the armies.
Right, yeah, it's the field commanders are doing a lot more than Rosecrans is. Did you, when you were studying this, did you find any of that kind of a different twist from the way Rosecrans had? It certainly did for me.
Yeah, Rosecrans, one of the things he comes in for criticism for was micromanaging during battles, skipping corps commanders and issuing orders directly to divisions or even brigades or regiments. Of course, part of that is because 2 of his 3 corps commanders are not very good. He has Thomas, who's brilliant, but he also has Cook and Crittenden, who are political appointments. So in an emergency, Rosecrans had a tendency to simply bypass them and go directly to issue the orders directly himself, which I think is kind of understandable. I did find that very different, but I think that could be because of the scope of the fighting in Missouri. Also, he's not getting positive reports about where Price's troops are. He's finding out where they are because he suddenly stops getting telegraphic communications from areas. So he's basically staying in St. Louis and dispatching troops to cover all possible eventualities. Also, I think what happened at Chickamauga might have had something to do with it. I was talking to someone last night in Milwaukee about this, about what happened at Chickamauga, because Rosecrans did make a crucial mistake there. And there's a lot more to that mistake. He issued an order that shouldn't have been issued, but by the same token, the officer who got it knew the order should not have been obeyed. He did it anyway because he was angry at Rosecrans. Rosecrans had a tendency in times of crisis to simply just keep going. You may have done this yourself. I have. And I know a lot of people who do. Because once you stop, you're done. You see Rob nodding. And I've been in situations like that. Probably quite a few of you have. Rosecrans was that kind of person. He would simply run on nervous energy until the crisis was past. He would depend on his reserves of strength and his intelligence and his ability to deal with issues as they arose. And he trusted his own judgment. And at Chickamauga, that let him down. That worked fine in Stones River, which is basically a 2-day fight. It worked fine in other battlefields where they're short. Chickamauga is a campaign. It drags on for a week or more. And the battle itself is several days long. And finally, when he makes this crucial mistake, I think he makes it because he's simply exhausted. We see it in Stonewall Jackson, the 7 days. We see it in a number of officers during the war and in other wars. So I think he kind of learned his lesson, too. I think he realized micromanaging simply wasn't going to work, particularly in a campaign setting like this. I think he did the right thing. He stayed in St. Louis and he directed his army, which Grant claimed he had done in a couple of cases in the war, but he didn't seem to direct much of anything.
Could I follow up on that?
Sure, absolutely.
The culprit with the bad order is Major Frank Varney for Chickamauga.
He wrote the order.
He writes the order that actually tells Wood to do two different things.
Right.
He can only obey one of the two.
Right.
So I don't know if Rosecrans actually saw the order before it gets handed to Curtis.
Indications are he didn't.
Yeah, I don't think he did.
Yeah.
The second thing is in terms of the relationship that you show later on in terms of how Garfield, I don't want to know, stabbed in the back is the right term. He's under pressure from Stanton.
Yes, he is.
When Rosecrans on the eve of Tullahoma pulls his corps commanders and says, should we advance? Is the cavalry ready to go? Ready to go? And everybody says no, except for Garfield. And Garfield sends him a note and even says to the point that he has a rare Frederikian-like quality. I mean, to be compared to Frederick the Great, you're in the pantheon of generalship as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And then it's quite almost shocking to see what happens to him on the flip side when he's heading on his way to Washington.
It really is. Garfield kind of does a 180. I like Garfield to a large degree, and I agree completely. He's under enormous pressure. Think about this. He's a newly minted congressman out of Washington, D.C., was intercepted by Edwin M. Stanton and Andrew Johnson, who's the military governor of Tennessee, and who will, of course, later be vice president of the United States, although certainly nobody knew it at the time, least of all Johnson. And he's told, this is not a suggestion, this is an order from the secretary, well, here's what you're going to tell the president. And he does. And he regrets it. I mean, one of the reasons Rosecrans is reinstated and he's given command of the Department of Missouri is because of the efforts of Garfield. I think Garfield tries very hard to, it could be Garfield is, nobody knows what he did outside of Lincoln and his cabinet, really. And it could be that he's trying desperately to make sure nobody does because there's talk of a congressional investigation. On the other hand, I think Garfield basically regretted it. I simply do. I think he's basically a decent human being who did something, and we've all probably know the people who've done this. I've seen people do it. I've been in the corporate world for 22 years. They do something to get ahead, and then they're sorry that they did it later. Yes, sir.
Don't you think that Rosecrans was kind of an easier target because of the way the Chickamauga played out, the fact that you had those who were still standing and those who were running away, that you had Thomas, and it became kind of a head count. Did this guy run? Did this guy stay? Did Sheridan go and come back? Did Garfield go?
I recognize some people have trains and things you have to catch, so you have to know about that.
Don't you think that was really used against Rosecrans more than it would have been if the whole army had just kind of fallen.
Yeah, it's a very fluid, chaotic battlefield situation. So yeah, I think you're probably right. I think also there's there are people who just don't like Rosecrans. I mean, as I said, he's kind of a prickly character. So, but yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think the whole situation of the Battle of Chickamauga, I think, does not work in his favor. Yes, sir.
Why did Stanton not like Rosecrans?
I knew somebody was going to ask me that. It's hard to say. First of all, early in the war, when Stonewall Jackson is carrying on his campaign in the Shenandoah Valley and just befuddling several Union generals, Rosecrans sends a telegram to Stanton suggesting that all the Union armies in the valley be united under his command. Stanton did not like people who blew their own horn, and he didn't like people who made suggestions. One Union general, whose name eludes me at the moment, but is in the book, sent a telegram to Rosecrans and basically said, "You're on Stanton's, bad list with that." Gideon Wells, he said he called Stanton a liar, a hypocrite, and a moral coward. Sherman said Stanton is a man who cherishes his grudges. I think it's as simple as that. I think he got a burr under his saddle about Rosecrans, and that was it. And we see numerous quotes from Stanton throughout the war. I won't send him another damn man. Rosecrans, one of his officers, Lovell Rousseau, has an idea about how to overcome the shortage of cavalry. With Rosecrans' permission, he contacts Washington. It looks like he's going to get a good response. He's dispatched to go to Washington, and he's completely shut down by Stanton. And he basically, in a gentlemanly 19th century fashion, refers to the completely objectionable quality of the conversation. I mean, Stanton was obviously incredibly rude and probably profane. So it's just Stanton being Stanton, I think. He's being what Ed Barrs called him.
Thank
Anybody
you for
else?
the words.
Yes.
I can't help but wonder too. A lot of it seems like personality type.
Yeah.
Governor Morris, you've got old Slow Trot. You've got all these cast of characters who don't embody initiative as the engine of success. So, was it personal with Grant? Did he hate all these guys? Was he some Machiavellian?
A lot of it is personal. Okay, here's the thing. Have you guys ever heard anything by Barry Strauss? He's a classical historian, really good historian, and he was one of my dissertation advisors. And Barry said to me, she reminded me of something that I should have had in the forefront of mind because I'm always after my students about it. Don't think of history as over. Think about it from the perspective of people who are living through it. And in 1862, Grant's been a failure all his life. He's not about to be a failure again. Mm-hmm. He's not going to go back to being what he was last year, which is clerking for his younger brother in the store in Galena, Ohio, and everybody laughing at him. So when he screws up, somebody's going to take the blame, but it's not going to be him. We have this vision in our head today of a successful man who became a great general and who then became president of the United States. But for most of the war, Grant probably felt like he was hanging on by his fingernails. And he tried very hard, anytime there was a criticism of him, even when he won a battle, to make sure the criticism went to somebody else. And there was something a bit Machiavellian about it. I haven't talked too much about the insertion of false documents and so forth. A lot of that takes place in, it'll be volume 2, and some other people are also looking into the same things I am. But there are several instances of it. I talked about the Battle of Belmont. Something similar happens in the Battle of Iuka. That's in the book. I found several instances of falsification of the official records of the War Department. Plus the fact, simply, stuff Grant said, other people are saying the exact opposite. So there's something strange going on here. So, for various reasons, he picked, and again, you mentioned old Slow Trot. There's a lot more to George H. Thomas than we think, and a lot of that is simply because of what Grant said about him in his memoirs. He damned him with faint praise. If he was ordered to hold a position, nobody could do it better, but essentially I wouldn't trust him on the attack. Except that Thomas did well on every battlefield where he served, on the defensive or on the offensive. But we again have this image, partly at least shaped by Grant. Gouverneur Kemble Warren, again, I think a much finer general than he's been given credit for, the 5th Corps Commander in the Army of the Potomac. But again, we're looking at him through the lens of a man who became his personal enemy. The question isn't that did Grant manipulate history, it's how did he do without us noticing? That's the part I find really interesting. Let's just do two more.
Is this the same thing? I mean, the story about Bragg arguing with himself.
Yeah.
Is that the only source is in Grant's? Memoir?
No.
Is that right? Or is there
No,
other
that
sources?
I've heard that from other sources
Okay.
as well. Yeah. Everybody here familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I almost told you the story. I put the picture in Bragg, but I didn't want to flagellate a defunct equine here.
The interesting thing is what you're saying in terms of how Grant looks at Rosecrans and Thompson, etc. Sherman takes the football and runs with it throughout the Atlantic campaign.
Yeah.
You know, where he sends notes to Grant, you know, that the army of Cumberland was dreadfully slow when they come
Yeah.
across a furrowed cornfield built a trench, which is just
Yeah.
slander. I mean, it's
Yeah.
absolute slander. And the guy that Sherman leans on for the tactical blessing, if you will, the attack at Kennesaw Mountain, which is not as big a dunderhead attack as a lot of people think, is Thomas.
Yeah.
And then who does Sherman send back to Tennessee to stop Hood? Thomas.
Yeah.
He's not sending Schofield goes, but Thomas is in charge.
One of the people I talk about in Volume 2 is Joe Hooker, I think, who gets much less credit for the Atlantic campaign than he deserves. I'm not a huge fan of Joe Hooker. There's a lot of things about him I don't like, particularly the way he undercut Burnside when Burnside was a security officer.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he was a much better general than we've come to believe. Not that he was brilliant, don't get me wrong, but I think he was highly effective in the right circumstances. He was an excellent division corps commander. All right, I could stand here and answer questions all night, but I'm also going to. If anybody wants, buy a book. They normally retail $32.95. I can sell them to you for $30. If you're interested, I'll be happy to autograph it for you. If you have a copy of your own that you brought, I'd certainly be happy to autograph that as well. Thank you very much.